Matt, welcome to the Natural Justice Podcast. Today we will be taking a deep dive into aquaculture. So to get us started, if anyone is listening, maybe has a little bit less of a background on aquaculture, if you had, let's say, just 2 minutes to explain what aquaculture is to someone, how would you describe what it is? Where does it take place? And why does it matter for the global food supply?
Yeah, it's one of the really funny things is that most people don't actually know what agriculture is. With part of my company, Spheric Consumer, we survey consumers and get insights from them. Most people don't know what it is. If you come from the starting point that if you eat fish caught from the sea, it's an animal that's hunted in the wild. And that doesn't happen anymore in most other terrestrial species like chicken or beef. It's just unheard of, but it still happens with fishing. So aquaculture is like the beginning of farming. And it's not really the beginning because the Chinese have been doing it for thousands of years, but most of modern aquaculture only started in the last half century. It's an industry where you can farm seafood on land, fish and shellfish, and other things as well, like seaweed. It's still quite in an initial phase of its development. There's very well-known industries like most of the salmon people eat in the world is farmed, or shrimp, for example. But there are species that are really just taking off with aquaculture.
Excellent. Thank you. You're an aquaculture guy. As we say, you've worked a lot in this sector and you know the different areas and elements of this sector very well. To learn a little bit about you, what is a personal goal that you set out for yourself when you went into this sector? Any personal motivations that really get you going in the morning to go to work that you'd like to share?
Yeah, sure. I started working as a commodities analyst and I started looking at copper and metals. And I then went and did agriculture pricing. And I kind of found seafood. And I think I liked it so much because it's got, I always enjoyed eating out. I think I've always enjoyed eating out. There's a certain glamour to eating fish and there was always a lot of confusion about where things come from, the metals, all that kind of stuff. But I've always been quite curious about. And as I got more into it, and I've got more into the business of seafood, I realized as well that it's incredibly global, amorphous industry that's around the world. It involves a lot of countries you've never heard of. And I think that part of the industry really captivated me as well.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me as well. It's just an industry that's so inherently international. Also, I find, people, once you start working in this sector, it's just kind of hard to leave. It just really grabs you. And
It
it's
does.
just endlessly,
Yes.
it's just endlessly fascinating. And you're always learning more about, like if you have more of a background in maybe biology, there's more to learn about like the economics or maybe the legal side of things. And then for me coming in as a lawyer, there's always just so much to learn about the species themselves and how do marine ecosystems work, and just find that endlessly fascinating. You mentioned it briefly. Aquaculture itself actually has very ancient roots, often associated with maybe farming it not only on land, but, in water environments. You focus on a more novel part maybe of the industry, which is land-based farming. Could you clarify what land-based aquaculture involves?
I'd say it's one of the things that we do. When we started out, when I started Spheric 8 years ago, I wasn't really sure which part of seafood we focus on. Like many early stage businesses, you think you've got an idea and then you sort of feel around. And one of the early things we did, when I really started to look at salmon farming in about 2018, I realized there was this huge trend with recirculating technology. So this technology was already used in hatcheries to grow the small fish from eggs to the smolt size, or the size when they go from the freshwater to the sea. There was a number of theories at the time that you could essentially you could use these systems on land to take fish to harvest weight. And that was relevant because the salmon industry really slowed down in the last decade. It was very difficult to find new growth. There was no real new areas where salmon farming could expand without significant challenges. And there were growing biological challenges as well. And at the same time, demand's going crazy because sushi is ever more popular. So we really looked at recirculating aquaculture systems and the hybrid versions of that. And we've really and we produce a report that's now in its 6th edition. We started it in, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And that industry has just blown up into a multi-billion dollar industry in that period of time. And I think that's the interesting thing is that in the case of, it's pretty much all about salmon because salmon's got very high demand, very high prices. It's like a
Mm.
kind of beef in the seafood industry.
Yeah, I've heard that when it comes to technology and investments in that, the salmon industry is really the main one to look at.
That's right. And so there are billions of dollars that are going into this this what we call land-based industry. Land-based is a bit
Hmm.
of a funny word because if you think of a shrimp pond, a traditional shrimp pond or a tilapia pond, that's on land as well.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
land-based aquaculture is kind of it's a funny expression, but when you're talking about salmon, it's these very modern systems where you're growing the fish in recirculating tanks.
Because salmon traditionally is not land-based, but grown in the net pen systems that are out in the sea, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm in southern Chile at the moment, and this is an industry. The whole of this town runs off the salmon industry, and it
Hmm.
really started from nothing in the 1970s. The people who built this industry were doing it as like a weekend gig before they had actually started to pay the bills. So in the
Yeah.
space of 30, 40 years, they built an industry that is a $5 billion a year industry, which is remarkable.
Chile historically doesn't really have a salmon farming industry, but I believe it was maybe brought there by Norwegian investors. Like, what's a bit of the
Yes.
history there, and how does that relate to, I guess, kind of the climate that a salmon needs to grow out in?
Yeah, it was initially Norwegian people. Actually, Norwegians only really started in the 1960s,
Okay.
but Chile followed maybe 10 or 20 years afterwards. The interesting thing is that Japanese investors were here very early on as well, and early in the day, in the 1980s, they started to look for areas that were suitable for trout and coho Pacific salmon. So really built by these foreign pioneers, and then as well Chilean entrepreneurs who built this industry up with CPAN. One of the interesting things here to link this back to recirculating aquaculture is that here in Chile there was a different. You didn't have the same freshwater resources as you have in Norway. There were big restrictions on using freshwater to to develop these flow through hatcheries. The Chileans had to figure out a way of doing the hatchery phase of production without the flow through where, the water goes in, the run of the river and then all of the sort of the effluents come out of the other side. And they actually stumbled upon RAS recirculating technology that was being built in Denmark. And there was a
Hmm.
Danish CEO of one of the major companies who said, I think this technology will work if you transplant it from Denmark. Right now, they're using it to grow eels, and you try and do it with salmon. And the Faroe Islands were doing it at the same time because there's no freshwater on the Faroe Islands. And that technology is the base or what I call the fulcrum of the salmon industry now. And it's used in all hatcheries, just about.
So if we compare the system where you farm, you do the grow out phase of, because the hatchery then is always a land-based process, but then the grow out phase traditionally with salmon, it's more in the net pen, so in the water. But if you compare that then to also doing that grow out phase with systems that are on land, like the RAS systems, what are some of the environmental advantage that we see now with having this possibility of doing that full life cycle of the salmon on land?
Yeah. So obviously, with CPEN, the fish crap in the sea. So that's just how it works, right? And
Hmm.
so the idea is that the CPENs are located when they're in a place, in a coastal location where there's enough current for for the salmon excrements to drift out to sea. But there is an environmental impact to this industry. Doing full cycle salmon farming on land does, in theory, solve that problem by basically you can take all of the excrement, you can turn it into other things, you can turn it into biogas, you can turn it into a fertilizer. But I would say that the industry is just not really there yet in
Hmm.
being able to do all of this production on land. We're just really seeing the first generation of farms. There's none that can really claim to be fully profitable yet. There's a couple
Hmm.
of hybrid systems in Norway and one or two in Denmark that are starting to get there,
Hmm.
but it's super early days. And really, to sort of supply enough all of the salmon that the world wants, you need both systems.
Yeah.
And if you look at the major salmon farming companies, they're very reluctant to give up their their sites in the sea. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a company potentially.
Hmm. Yeah. It needs time. But then, so the main environmental advantage could be that, there's not that pollution on, the seabed and just the natural environment, but rather you control that part of the system as well, because you can take that and actually even make it into recircular system and use that for something useful as well.
There's a couple of it's a fairly nuanced concept. There's the
Mhm.
thing is now that with recirculating, the biggest trend that's been in research systems in the last 10, 15, 20 years
Mhm.
is what they call post smolt. So you traditionally you would use these hatchery systems, you get the fish to about 100, 150 grams in weight, and then you put them out to sea. And you have a certain mortality rate. The fish are in the sea for 20 months. It can be 2 summers. And the problem that the sea pen industry has is that in the second summer, a lot of the fish die before they reach the ideal harvest weight. So post smolt, what it does, it kind of staves off the maturation phase of the fish, and you're able to keep them on land for a longer period of time. So instead of 100 grams, you take them up to 200, 300, 400. I think the average now in Norway is probably about 300.
Mhm.
And so when you do that, you shorten the sea pen cycle. And with that, you do two things. One is that you take the fish out of the water for the second summer, where you get a lot of the mortality. The other thing as well is that because you're shortening the sea pen cycle, you can actually produce more fish over time. So
Mhm.
that's been really the biggest the trend in the industry. It's happened in Norway and the Faroes, and it hasn't happened as much in Chile and Canada. And some would say that's because these regulations have not been that favorable to investment. These systems require very big investments. On the other hand, to sort of put forward the argument of the salmon farming companies as well are rapidly adopting new forms of cage technology. At the moment, what they're doing is they're instead of the traditional sea pen that kind of floats on the surface of the
Mhm.
water, they're now using submersible pens, which kind of takes them below the levels where they get the sea lice, and it's slightly cooler temperatures as well. And they're using something called semi-closed containment, where it's more of a protective barrier. They look a lot more sophisticated as a cage.
Mhm.
And there's this kind of ambition or thought that in the future, you would achieve full closed containment cages in the sea, which, like land based, you can collect the excrement and
Mhm.
therefore you can improve the environmental footprint of salmon farming. There are things as well going on. There's some pumping technology now where they're able to pump out some of the sludge from the tanks. So there are these little small incremental improvements as well in the sea-based technology. But that part is moving really fast. It's not like the land-based technology is the only solution. There's also
Mhm.
a lot of stuff happening in the sea.
Exactly. So we see a lot of innovation with both technologies, which is, as you mentioned, very much needed because it takes a lot of investment to get land-based systems going. With the demand that we have right now, with most of the salmon coming from farmed salmon, it's just not realistic to think that that's going to be able to replace us. So it's excellent to see a lot of the innovations happening in both spaces at the same time. And then it seems like it is mostly focusing on either solving some of the pollution challenges that we have with salmon farming on its direct environment, as well as the mortality rates. Can you explain just very briefly for someone who's less familiar with that mortality rates and why this is so important as well when we're talking about the environmental sustainability really of this product?
Yeah. So salmon's mortality is and aquaculture mortality is quite high. It's in the last couple of years it's been around 20%, which when you really think about it is pretty bad.
Hmm.
It means that one in every fish don't reach their intended purpose, which is to get to harvest weight. Most regulators and governments around the world have recognized that's a big problem, right? This year came up with a new uh, proposal to change its regulatory framework for salmon farming. The new framework is really a dramatic overturn of everything, and it's all based on the mortality numbers. It means that if you have higher mortality numbers in a certain pen, you have to pay for that. And so
Okay.
what the companies are looking at initially is that they've got to reduce densities quite dramatically to get
Hmm.
mortality numbers in line with the government targets. In the future, when new technologies allow them to achieve higher densities without the mortality rates, they could actually produce more. But the point is they have to invest in the technology.
Yeah. So that's really driving a lot of the, I guess, investments in the innovation there, as well as the research. Because as I've always understood it, with farming of fish, when it comes to health and welfare of the fish, is that it's not necessarily less density is always better. There's just kind of an ideal number or range, I guess, for certain environments, and it's
Yeah.
really it's not easy. Like, a lot of science and needs to come into play here.
It's not easy, and it's not a consistent challenge for the
Mhm.
farmers from one year to the next, because in the last 5 years we've seen some crazy variances in temperatures that we've never seen before,
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
have brought a whole host of new problems. It's just, actually, if you look at the R&D spend of the salmon farming companies, especially in Norway, it's very high. It's been something like 2 to 3% of revenue. So there's a lot of money that gets reinvested in new technology, but that hamster wheel has to go very fast to just keep up with the level of adversity that they're facing with changing oceanographic conditions and that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The episode before this, we talked about this, really the impact that climate change and just, change in the environments has on fisheries and aquaculture, and that, from financial perspective also, that can be really challenging for businesses,
Yeah,
because they're just not really sure what they're looking at, and you don't want to be investing into things that are only gonna, last for 1 or 2 years, because the conditions are continuously changing. So that's a real
right.
big challenge, I think, in this context. Salmon farming, and generally we've talked about, the different ways of doing it, and the different technologies available there. Is there anything that's available now that has really been able to, like, drive this, that wasn't available in the past? Any specific, innovations that were really life changing for the salmon sector?
I think I'd say that the RAS tech, the just the mastery of RAS technology to grow larger smolt has been the one in the last 10 years that's been the biggest tool in the toolbox of the salmon farming industries. To I think now that you've seen, the first generation of farms, the people building the next generation are starting to take the learnings from mistakes made with all aspects of the farm to make them better, more reliable, less prone to failures. I'd say as well, though, at the moment in Norway, there's a really big push for the sea-based technology now. I think that's the
Hmm.
thing that's going the fastest right now is
Hmm.
submersible cages, and also just the fact they're able to do this because you've got this accompanying rapid advance in technologies. So cameras are a huge one. The level of camera technology now is vastly superior to what it was 2, 3 years ago. Farms are getting run remotely. And that's the transition that needs to happen to take the fish underwater, because you can't see them anymore. So you're
Yeah,
relying less
exactly.
on the human eye, and
Yeah.
you're looking at them digitally underwater. So that's been
Yeah.
a really big thing as well. That
Yeah.
technology can help all species, not just salmon. And it has
Yeah,
been.
exactly. really analyzing, being able to maybe detect some risks, things that should be further inspected, really, I think is very helpful as well for the kind of the monitoring of the feed. I think with camera technology, I hear this sometimes also in the context of AI, how AI is really helping this type of analysis. What role do you see that AI is playing right now with salmon farming?
It's really enabling this transition to camera technology. The cameras, in some cases, are able to actually latch onto the performance of individual fish, which is obviously far beyond the capability of any human being. And I think that's really helping to understand problems, illnesses, different challenges. They're able to adjust feeding patterns and cycles to fish appetite. They're using all sorts of sensors, acoustics to really understand what is going on under the water. I think that's really driving improvement and performance and efficiency. I think as well, there's another part of it as well. There's a lot of robotics now as well. Take away a lot of the manual labor, some of the riskier parts. There's a lot of divers and fatalities. But there are other things as well, like the robots can go out, for example, a very practical example, as the farms, it's desirable for the farms to go further offshore where they have less of a impact in a coastal environment. And the robots now are able to do the moorings, so they can dig the holes for the moorings in a fraction of the time that human beings can. Also cleaning the nets. One of the big ecological disasters that salmon farming had was a few years ago up in Washington State. You might have heard of this one, but there was a salmon farm that was basically sunk, and it was in the front page of the Seattle Times for months. It kind of affected the whole debate in Canada as well about salmon
Hmm.
farming in British Columbia. You
Yeah.
had this giant mess just south of the border. And that was down to it was a company that had run out of money and had sold the asset to a new company. The nets hadn't
Mm.
been cleaned in a long time, and you start to get all these problems. So there's a lot of things that are being, I'd say robotics as well, it's quite significant. And then eventually what's going to happen is these farms are going to go offshore, or they're going to go on remote vessels. So all of this technology is essential to have in place before you can put them miles offshore.
That actually segues very well into my next question, which is, what's kind of on the horizon? We've seen a lot of innovation already in this space. Is there anything where it's like, okay, we're kind of waiting to get to this point, so this can happen? You mentioned kind of remote vessels. What is that? How does that work? And what needs
Yeah,
to
that's
happen?
that's one of the splashy ones.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on in China. China's always
Hmm.
struggling with in the South China Sea. There's a move to marine aquaculture, but as well there's a lot of testing of putting the fish on vessels. They're already starting to do this actually with abalones. So abalones is a
Hmm.
delicacy in Asia that used to be very expensive. So now they farm it, but because of temperature change, they have a real problem with having the abalones at the right temperature. They actually ship them up and down the coast of China to just have them at the ideal temperature.
Oh,
So
wow.
China's doing an awful lot with vessels, and sometimes not building new vessels, but just
Hmm.
repurposing old ones to house fish. So that's quite a big one that's going on. With land-based, it's not so much that people are developing a completely new system that's going to phase out the old technology. I'd say
Hmm.
it's more about very small improvements. There's a lot of new suppliers. We track the number of companies and suppliers that come in to innovate in
Hmm.
land-based. There's a lot of big companies that sell things to multiple industries that have taken an interest. They've seen it as a growth sector, and they think, our hub or our device could be used in that industry. And so you see, there's lots of these kind of tiny little tweaks and improvements that I think are making a difference in the long run.
What are maybe some of the other elements of sustainable production that these improvements are targeting besides pollution or the mortality rates?
I think something that we haven't covered is talking about species other than salmon. It's a
Hmm.
topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about because we really look quite a lot at whitefish markets where there's not a great deal of industry intelligence. One of the problems you have is that when these RAS or land-based companies go to get finance,
Mhm.
they're able to prove that the economics of farming salmon is absolutely amazing. Norwegian companies haven't recorded a quarterly loss for 15 years. Absolutely remarkable performance. And so it's been relatively easy to get finance for an Atlantic salmon farm
Mhm.
than, let's say, type of premium whitefish or even a trout, which actually could probably perform a lot better in a land-based system. Atlantic salmon are really finicky animals. If the temperature's just off, they're not happy and they get stressed. Trout, for example, is a fish that, if it's grown well, a large trout can be super nice. It can
Mhm.
really fulfill that appetite for a lot of salmon. In actual fact,
Yeah.
I've just been in Indonesia and Vietnam, Japan, where trout can be sold as salmon.
Yeah. Very similar use.
And it
Yeah.
works a lot better in a RAS system.
Mhm.
So there's that. And I think as well as like there's a lot of premium whitefish that became scarce. There's all types of things like halibut and turbot and sole that, due to the declines in wild catch, have just become a bit of a luxury item and you don't see them that much anymore. Those things can make a comeback with RAS technology. You can bring back species that were once abundant and make them just a little bit more affordable again, and that they could actually start to appear on restaurant menus with year-round supply. And so I spend a lot of time looking at the economics of these whitefish species and trying to put forward the case for investment that it makes sense and that there's a market for good quality fish.
So, do I understand then correctly? Maybe salmon, because of the high demand, was, there was an interest to also see that in the context of RAS systems, not necessarily because it's the most suitable, but just to see how can we safely increase the production there. But there's many other species, some whitefish species, trout, that are suitable for RAS, and that the
Yeah,
land-based aquaculture is really offering a solution there.
an interesting fact, the biggest company in land-based glass systems is a subsidiary of a company that is an oil and gas company in Norway called Stolt Nielsen. And
Hmm.
these guys have an entire aquaculture company called Stolt Sea Farm that produce turbot and sole fish in Spain and Portugal. That alone is a 120 million euros a year company. And it's been profitable in every single quarter of its existence since the third quarter of 2001, which was the
Hmm.
pandemic. And it
Hmm.
was the second quarter, which is the second quarter is the weakest quarter traditionally in Europe because if you're growing sole, you're getting
Hmm.
ready for the European summer when everybody's in a restaurant somewhere in the
Yeah.
Mediterranean. And there's these kinds of stories that I think people don't really know about. So there's a lot of potential for this technology to help to bring back other species, to get more variety on seafood menus, that type of thing.
I've not heard of this technology specifically. I know that, sole is a very historically an important species for fisheries of my home country, of the Netherlands, but has
Yeah,
been challenging to have a sustainable fishery because they're on the bottom, right? So how do you catch that
right.
without destroying the seabed? So it's very promising to see. I love that about aquaculture, how you're just constantly seeing these innovations. And also when my friends ask me with questions with their perceptions of aquaculture and things they hear maybe in a documentary or an article or something, that it's, by that time it's already old data. Same with what I think we've seen a lot with the fish in, fish out ratio in terms of how efficient it actually is to grow certain species, right? And if we're looking at a carbon footprint, we've seen a lot of improvements there as well
Yeah.
with fish farming. So where do you see the future for the industry? So we had some, we know that there may be some hurdles because they can come with high costs, and
Hmm.
any other challenges with scaling some of these technologies.
I think the big challenge is on feed.
Hmm.
When you're talking about all of these premium type species, they're often carnivorous
Hmm.
species, and they require normally fed partly with marine ingredients, which
Yeah.
means fish meal and fish oil, and that is in finite supply. And like everything else in the last few years, anything that's in the ocean there's very erratic years. And so, for example, in Peru, you have the Nino, the ocean cycle, which has really affected the world's largest fishery. It's this sort of bounty that was really helping aquaculture to get the marine ingredients that it needs. That's now, you'll still get good years from Peru and the Northern Atlantic, but you now get bad ones. And so it's a real conundrum because there's also innovation there. You have the alternative proteins, you have the alternative oils. The alternative oils have actually done quite well because that's where the shortage was most critical. That really
On
wasn't
the oil
enough
side.
of the
Yeah.
omegas to go around. So you have these algae ingredients now that have actually managed to get some meaningful market share. And that really hasn't happened on the protein side. And it's very difficult for, let's say, for example, a startup to come in and say, okay, I'm going to make this alternative protein ingredient because you know that out of 1 year out of 5, you're going to get a good cycle and Peru is going to have a bumper catch, 2 million tons. You have to tell your investors that, look, there's going to be 1 out of 5 years where it's going to be absolutely disastrous and we won't make any money. Most investors are not willing to back that type of
No
company,
thanks.
right? So
Hard pass.
it's a real problem. And I think there's a whole it's a very deep issue and you can get very deep into it. The whole pelagic fish industry is highly complex. The fish go everywhere in the world. They go to all types of different people for all types of different purposes. I think that a big step forward for the aquaculture industry is to figure out how it improves its performance with the feed and the feed ingredients, which allows future sustainable growth. There's a lot of trimmings, so now fish will get caught. There's a lot more
Mhm.
of the scales and the bones and this what have you that now goes into feed, which is great. But there's a lot more that needs to happen, I think, on that side. That's a
Yeah.
really important part of the aquaculture story.
Yeah, this is what I hear from a lot of, the supply chain companies in the seafood sector as well, because they know this is just really one of, if we're talking about responsible seafood production, this is just one of the main topics we need to work on, which I think we've known for
Yeah,
a while, but I do see it gaining a little bit more momentum, that focus on feed and
I
to
think so
really,
too. Yeah,
yeah, further accelerate that innovation and sustainability in aquaculture. So thanks so much for talking to me today, Matt. It's
no
been
worries.
really a pleasure to be able to, dive deep into aquaculture, which we haven't done too much yet for the Natural Justice podcast. And I really appreciate you sharing your experience in Chile, Norway. Seems like you've really been everywhere with this sector.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing about it. I think that's what I was partly hoping for, and it certainly is that.